Alara was 24 years old the day her world shrank to the size of a single canvas satchel. The house, the one her grandfather had built with his own hands, the one that smelled of pine sap and sawdust and the faint metallic tang of his tools, was no longer hers. Her uncle Marcus, her mother's brother, and a man who measured life in ledgers and accounts, had handled the affair with the bloodless efficiency of a banker, foreclosing on a stranger. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply sat her down at the polished oak table her grandfather had made and explained the mechanics of her dispossession. The estate was settled. The property was sold. She had until the end of the week. She did not cry. She did not plead. The grief for her grandfather, Silas, was a cold, heavy stone in her chest, a weight too dense for tears. He had been gone 6 months, and in that time, the silence in his workshop had grown louder than any noise. It was in that workshop she had truly been raised. While other girls learned stitchery and social graces, Alara learned the language of wood and stone. Silas had taught her to read the grain of a plank, to feel the truth of a level with her fingertips, to swing a hammer with an economy of motion that was both powerful and graceful. He was a surveyor and a master carpenter, a man who believed the world could be understood and set right with the proper application of skill and patience. "There are 2 kinds of truth in this world, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting underwater. "The truth people tell you, and the truth a plumb line tells you. One of them will never lie." He had bequeathed to her this philosophy, and something more tangible, a heavy, brass plumb bob, shaped like a tapered acorn, suspended from a cord of braided leather. It was his first and most treasured tool. She had watched him use it 1,000 times, letting it hang still and silent, a perfect, uncompromising line to the center of the earth. It was the physical manifestation of his soul, solid, true, and pointing downward towards solid ground. It now rested in her satchel, its weight a small, cold comfort. Marcus slid a thin envelope across the table. "This is the remainder of the settlement, after expenses," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. $300. It should be enough for you to get a start somewhere else." He said "somewhere else" as if it were a town on a map, a place one could simply buy a ticket to. For Alara, who had never known any other home, it was a blank void. The sum was an insult, a pittance for a lifetime of memories, but she took it. Arguing with Marcus was like arguing with a stone wall, and she had learned from Silas that when faced with an immovable object, you do not waste your energy pushing. You walk around it. She spent the last few days in the workshop, not building, but choosing. She could not take the heavy saws or the workbench. She could take only what she could carry. She selected a small dovetail saw with a cherry handle worn smooth by her grandfather's grip, a set of chisels, each blade honed to a razor's edge, a hand drill, a marking gauge, a small framing square, and a leather roll to keep them in. She packed them alongside a change of clothes, a whetstone, a tin of matches, and a small, cast-iron skillet. When the satchel was full, its strap dug into her shoulder, heavy with the dense reality of her new life. On the final morning, she walked out the door and did not look back. To look back would be to invite the ghosts of what she had lost to follow her, and she needed every ounce of her strength for the road ahead. She walked, the road unspooled before her, a ribbon of dust leading away from the gentle, rolling hills of her childhood and toward the jagged, blue-black teeth of the distant mountains. Those were the ranges Silas had spoken of, the wild lands he had surveyed in his youth. He spoke of them with a mixture of reverence and caution, a place where a person's competence was all that stood between them and oblivion. It was a place, he'd said, that stripped you down to what you truly were. Alara had $300, a bag of tools, and the lessons of her grandfather. She hoped it would be enough. For 3 days, she walked, sleeping in haylofts and under the cover of dense pine groves. She bought bread and cheese in small towns, her interactions with people brief and practical. On the fourth day, she arrived in the county seat of Stonefall, a town huddled in the shadow of the mountains, its buildings made of the same gray granite as the cliffs above. The air was thinner here, sharper, carrying the scent of cold stone and pine resin. It felt like the edge of the world. Fagrer, the county clerk's office, was a dusty, sun-bleached room that smelled of old paper and dry rot. A balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, a Mr. Gable, presided over a counter scarred with the ink of 100 years of transactions. As Alara waited, she overheard him speaking with two prospectors, their faces weathered and leather tough. "You'd be wasting your time," Gable said, a note of smug amusement in his voice. "Every deed in this valley, going back to the founding, skips the same 40 acres, right up in the Black Creek Ravine." "Why's that?" one of the men asked, leaning on the counter. "They call it the Sump," Gable explained, clearly enjoying his role as the keeper of local lore. "Or Holloway's Folly. Some surveyor named Holloway tried to settle it 80, maybe 100 years ago. Story goes the land is cursed. It's a steep, rocky hole, swamp at the bottom. He built a stone house down in it, and the whole thing collapsed on him in a mudslide. Nothing but a pile of haunted rubble now. The land's never been properly recorded because no one's ever wanted it. It's a dead parcel, a blank spot on the map." The prospectors grunted, their interest fading. A curse was one thing, but bad geography was another. They soon left, and Alara stepped forward. The words, "blank spot on the map," had snagged in her mind, a place that belonged to no one. "Can I help you?" Gable asked, his tone dismissive. He looked at her worn boots and the heavy satchel on her shoulder, and his eyes catalogued her as a vagrant. "That parcel of land," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The one you were just talking about, Holloway's Folly." Gable raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "If it's unrecorded, can a person file a claim on it?" she asked. He stared at her for a long moment, then a slow, pitying smile spread across his face. "Ma'am, you don't want that land. It's 40 acres of rocks and mud. It's worthless." "Can a claim be filed?" she repeated, her gaze steady. He sighed. The performance of it all meant to highlight her foolishness. "Technically, yes. It would be a primary filing on unclaimed territory. You'd have to pay for the survey and filing fees, $250. He named the price with a finality that he clearly thought would end the conversation. It was a steep price, designed to dissuade. Alara opened her worn leather purse. She counted out $250 from her meager inheritance and placed the bills on the counter. The sight of the money surprised him. The smile fell from his face, replaced by a look of baffled curiosity. "You're serious?" he asked. "I am," she said. He shook his head, a little laugh escaping his lips as he began to shuffle through papers and pull out a large, linen-backed map. He treated the entire transaction as a grand joke, making little comments to the empty room about throwing good money after bad. Alara ignored him. She signed her name where he indicated, her hand steady. She was now the owner of 40 acres of worthless, cursed land. For the first time in a week, she felt a flicker of something that was not grief or fear. It was the grim, quiet resolve of a builder standing before a pile of rubble, seeing not a ruin, but a beginning. With the deed in her satchel and $50 to her name, she walked out of the clerk's office and toward the Black Creek Ravine. The journey to the property took the rest of the day. The trail narrowed from a wagon track to a game path, winding ever deeper into the mountains. The air grew cooler, the silence more profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ancient pines and the rush of a distant creek. By late afternoon, she stood at the lip of the ravine. Mr. Gable had not exaggerated. It was a deep, V-shaped cleft in the earth, its sides a chaotic jumble of fractured granite and scree. At the bottom, 100 feet below, was a dark, marshy flatland, choked with thorn bushes and skeletal dead trees. and in the center of it, half submerged in the bog, was the ruin. It was worse than she had imagined. From this distance, it looked like a mouthful of broken teeth. A few jagged sections of stone wall stood defiant, but the rest was a heap of collapsed masonry and fallen roof timbers, draped in curtains of moss and vines. A profound wave of despair washed over her, so cold and sharp it almost buckled her knees. She had traded her last hope for a pile of stones in a swamp. For a long moment, she just stood there, the weight of her satchel and the totality of her foolishness pressing down on her. Then she remembered her grandfather's hands. She remembered the calm, methodical way he would approach a problem, never looking at the whole, overwhelming task, but only at the first, single step. Find shelter. That was the first step. She took a deep breath, the pine-scented air steadying her nerves, and began the treacherous descent into the ravine. Up close, the ruin was even more intimidating. The stones were massive, hewn with skill but now scattered like a child's blocks. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of wet earth and rotting wood. She circled the perimeter, her boots sinking into the soft ground. Most of the structure was indefensible, open to the elements, but in the northeast corner, two walls still met at a right angle, and a massive, fire-blackened chimney stack stood almost entirely intact. A section of the heavy timbered roof, though sagging, still covered this small corner. It was a cave more than a room, but it was shelter. She spent the last hour of daylight clearing the space. She hauled out splintered timbers and heaps of fallen plaster, her muscles burning with the effort. She used the flat of a broken slate shingle as a makeshift spade, scraping away a thick layer of damp, mulchy leaves to reveal a floor of heavy flagstones. They were uneven and slick with slime, but they were solid beneath her feet. As darkness fell, she had cleared a small 10 by 10 foot area. It was not a home, but it was a foothold. She ate a piece of dry bread, wrapped herself in her thin blanket, and lay down on the cold stones, the brass plumb bob a solid weight against her chest. She slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, the groan of the old timbers her only lullaby. The next days fell into a rhythm of labor. Her first priority was survival. She found the creek that fed the sump and followed it upstream until the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. She gathered firewood from the heaps of fallen timber. Her world was reduced to the essential, a cycle of hard, physical work that left no room for despair. The methodical labor was a balm. Each stone she moved, each branch she cleared, was a small victory against the chaos. It was on the 5th day that she made the discovery. She was working on the interior of her small shelter, trying to clear the great stone hearth that dominated the back wall. The chimney was a masterpiece of masonry, its stones fitted together with a precision that stood in stark contrast to the cruder work on the outer walls. It was the work of a true artist, and it reminded her so keenly of Silas that a pang of grief shot through her. As she scraped away the accumulated grime and soot from the firebox, her fingers traced the lines of the mortar. Above the opening, a single, massive piece of granite served as the lintel, the keystone that supported the weight of the chimney above. Something about it was wrong, or rather, different. It was a slightly paler shade of gray than the surrounding stones, its surface smoother, showing less of the pitting and wear from a century of smoke and heat. It was subtle, something only a person trained to look for inconsistencies in structure would ever notice. She remembered Silas tapping on walls, listening for the change in tone that signaled a hidden stud or a hollow space. On an impulse, she took the handle of her chisel and tapped the stone lintel. The sound was a dull thud. She tapped the stones beside it. Thud, thud. Then she tapped the center of the lintel again. But this time she listened more closely. It was not a thud. It was a thump. A lower, resonant note. A sound with depth. A hollow sound. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She ran her fingers along the edges of the stone, feeling for a seam. The mortar was tight, perfect. There was no visible crack. But the sound did not lie. She took out her grandfather's plumb bob. She let it hang from its leather cord, the brass point hovering just inches from the face of the stone. It was perfectly still, perfectly true. She looked from the plumb bob to the stone, as if the tool could reveal its secrets. Her grandfather had taught her that every structure has a key, a single piece upon which everything else depends. Perhaps this was more than just a keystone. She needed leverage. She found a long, iron pry bar in the rubble, a remnant of the original construction. Using a smaller stone as a fulcrum, she wedged the tip of the bar into the tight mortar joint at the top of the lintel. She put her weight on it. Nothing. The stone was immovable, locked in place by its own immense weight and the builder's skill. She stopped, breathing heavily. Brute force was not the answer. Silas had always said that. Understand the construction. Understand how it was made, and you will understand how to unmake it. She studied the stone again, this time with a craftsman's eye. How would she have set such a stone if she wanted it to be removable? There would be a locking mechanism, or a specific point of leverage. Her eyes scanned the surrounding stones. Below the lintel, on the right side of the firebox, was a smaller, fist-sized stone that seemed almost decorative. It was darker than the others, almost black, and polished smooth. It didn't quite fit the rustic aesthetic of the rest of the hearth. She pushed on it. It didn't move. She tried to pry it, but there was no purchase. Frustrated, she slumped against the cold chimney. As her hand slid down the stones, her fingers brushed against the polished black rock, and she felt it shift, almost imperceptibly, under her palm. Not in or out, but sideways. Her breath caught. She pressed her palm flat against it and pushed firmly to the left. With a low grinding sound, the black stone slid sideways into a hidden recess in the wall, revealing a small, dark cavity. Her hand shaking slightly, she reached inside. Her fingers closed around a cold, iron ring. She pulled. A deep, resonant clank echoed from within the chimney, and she saw the massive granite lintel shift downward by a fraction of an inch. It had been resting on a hidden bolt, a bolt she had just retracted. Now, when she put the pry bar in the seam and applied pressure, the great stone groaned in protest. It tilted forward slowly, pivoting on its bottom edge. It was incredibly heavy, and she had to use all her strength to control its descent, guiding it down until it rested on the flagstone floor with a heavy boom that shook the small room. Behind it was a dark, square opening, a man-made cavern within the mass of the chimney. The air that wafted out was stale and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly oily. She lit a splinter of pine for a torch and held it up to the opening. The space was small, no bigger than a sea chest, and it was not empty. In the center sat a large package wrapped in thick, oiled canvas and tied with heavy tarred rope. Beside it was a leather-bound book, its cover dark and unmarked. It took all her strength to drag the heavy bundle out of the hole. She set it on the floor, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and wild, exhilarating hope. With her knife, she sawed through the stiff, tarry ropes. She unfolded the stiff, crackling canvas. The torchlight glinted off the contents, and she let out an involuntary gasp. The bundle was filled with gold coins, hundreds of them. They were not neatly stacked, but lay in a glittering heap, heavy and solid and real. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen or imagined. For a moment, she could only stare, her mind unable to process the reality of it. It was pirate treasure, a dragon's hoard, a fairy tale made real in the heart of a ruin. After a long while, her gaze fell upon the leather ledger. It was a far greater treasure than the gold. She picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She opened it. The first page was filled with elegant, angular script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. "My name is Elias Holloway," it began. "I was a stonemason and a surveyor. If you are reading this, it means you have found my home, and you have found my secret. It likely means I am long dead, and the world has forgotten me. I hope that is the case." Ilara sat down on the cold floor, the gold forgotten, and began to read. The journal was the story of a life. Elias Holloway had been a man much like her grandfather. He was a craftsman, a man who found his faith in the logic of stone and the truth of a straight line. He had come to this valley from a city back east, after being cheated and ruined by a business partner who had been like a brother to him. Betrayed and heartbroken, he had sought not revenge, but solitude. He had used the last of his money to buy this remote, unwanted ravine, a place so inhospitable he knew no one would ever follow him. He had built this house not as a home, but as a fortress against the world, a monument to his own resilience. The journal was filled with sketches, with detailed architectural drawings of the house, with notes on masonry and carpentry, and it was filled with his thoughts. He wrote of the quiet joy of labor, of the satisfaction of shaping the raw materials of the earth into something of order and beauty. He had discovered a small, rich vein of gold while quarrying stone for the foundation. He had mined it out himself, not for wealth, but as a project, another puzzle to be solved. The gold was his final act of creation, a secret legacy. His words resonated with Ilara on a level so deep it felt like kinship. His loneliness, his retreat into the solace of work, his belief in competence as a form of salvation, it was the echo of her own heart. "I have no wife, no child, no heir to which I can pass my trade," he wrote on one of the final pages. "The world that betrayed me has no claim on what I have built here. Therefore, I leave this house, and the fruits of this land, to the one who finds it, not to a treasure hunter, but to a builder, to one who sees the truth in the stone and is not afraid of the work. If you have opened this wall, you are that person. This is my last will and testament. Use this gold not for vengeance or for idle luxury, but to finish what I began. Build a life here. Find the peace that I only found in solitude. Let this not be Holloway's folly, but Holloway's rest. This is my blessing upon you." Ilara closed the book, and for the first time since her grandfather's death, she wept. She cried not from grief or despair, but from a profound, aching sense of gratitude. She was not alone. A stranger, dead for a century, had reached across time and given her a purpose. He had given her a blueprint, a fortune, and a blessing. She was not a vagrant in a ruin. She was an heir. She was the steward of Holloway's rest. The discovery of the gold and the journal changed everything. The work was no longer a matter of mere survival. It was an act of restoration, of fulfilling a legacy. With Holloway's detailed drawings from the ledger and the skills Silas had ingrained in her, Ilara began the methodical, painstaking process of rebuilding the house. The gold gave her the means, but the knowledge gave her the power. Her first trip back to Stonefall was a different experience. She walked into the general store, a list in her hand, and began to purchase supplies: bags of lime for mortar, new rope, pulleys, a heavy-duty canvas tarp, and provisions to last for weeks. The owner was a sturdy, no-nonsense woman named Martha, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She watched as Ilara paid for the large order with a crisp gold coin. She didn't ask where it came from. She simply nodded, her expression shifting from curiosity to respect. "My husband runs a freight line," Martha said, her voice practical. "If you need heavy supplies brought up the trail, he can do it. Cheaper than you hauling it yourself." It was an offer of help disguised as a business proposition, and Ilara accepted gratefully. Her next stop was the blacksmith's forge. The smith, a burly man named Abel with arms like tree limbs, was initially gruff. He was hammering a glowing piece of iron on his anvil, the ringing of the hammer filling the smoky air. "What do you want?" he grunted, not looking up. Ilara didn't waste words. She unrolled one of Holloway's drawings on a clear section of a workbench. It was a detailed design for a set of custom-made strap hinges for the heavy timber window shutters. "I need a dozen of these," she said, and a set of pintles to match. The iron needs to be of this thickness, and the finish should be fire-blackened and oiled. Abel stopped hammering. He wiped his brow with the back of a sooty hand and looked, first at her, then at the drawing. He picked it up, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He studied the precise measurements, the elegant, functional design. He looked at the other tools in her satchel, recognizing the quality of the old steel. His expression softened. He saw not a lost girl, but a fellow craftsperson. "This is good work," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Haven't seen a drawing this clean in years. Who drew it?" "A man named Elias Holloway," she said. Abel nodded slowly. "I can make these, but it will take time. The forge on my water wheel needs repair. The main shaft is cracked." "I can help with that," Alara said without hesitation. "I know timber framing." A deal was struck. It was not charity. It was a trade of skills, a partnership born of mutual respect. While Abel forged her hardware, Alara spent 2 days at his forge, helping him hew and fit a massive new oak shaft for his water wheel, her grandfather's adze feeling like a natural extension of her arms. Word began to spread through the small, scattered community. The story of the strange young woman who had bought the cursed sump and was now rebuilding it became a piece of local lore. She was mostly seen from a distance, a solitary, determined figure moving stones and hoisting timbers. Her work was watched by a reclusive old trapper named Jed, who lived in a small cabin further up the mountain. He watched her for weeks from the cover of the trees, his weathered face impassive. He saw her skill, her tireless pace, the way she moved with purpose. One evening, as she was mixing a batch of mortar, he emerged silently from the woods. He was gaunt and bearded, dressed in buckskin. He didn't speak at first, simply stood and watched her work. Alara, sensing no threat, continued her task. Finally, he gestured with his chin toward the newly set wall. "Good bond," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You keep your stones wet before you set them. Most people don't know that." "My grandfather taught me," she replied. He nodded. He set a bundle of rabbit pelts on a clean stone. "Winter's coming early this year. You'll need these." He turned to leave. "Wait," Alara called out. "What do I owe you?" Jed paused and looked back at her. "Nothing," he said. "Good to see this place with a fire in the hearth again. Holloway was a good man. Quiet." He then melted back into the forest, leaving Alara with the furs and the startling realization that someone remembered the man who had written the ledger. Months passed. The ruin slowly transformed. Using a system of ropes and pulleys anchored to the strong chimney, Alara hoisted the fallen roof timbers back into place. She learned to reeve shingles from blocks of cedar, splitting them along the grain until she had enough to cover the restored roof. She reglazed the window openings, setting the small panes of glass she'd bought from Martha into the newly hinged shutters Abel had forged. The stone house grew from a shell into a home. One crisp autumn afternoon, a man on horseback appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Mr. Gable, the county clerk, out for a hunt. He stopped his horse, his mouth falling open in disbelief. He had clearly expected to find her bones, or at the very least, an abandoned camp. Instead, he saw a solid, beautiful stone house, smoke curling peacefully from its chimney. The boggy sump had been partially drained by a carefully dug channel, and a small garden was already tilled for the following spring. He stared at the house, at Alara standing on the porch, her hands on her hips, covered in stone dust, but radiating a quiet confidence. He did not approach. He simply turned his horse around and rode away, his face a mask of humbled astonishment. The story of Holloway's folly was officially over. The era of Holloway's rest had begun. The first snows came in late October, weeks earlier than predicted. They were light at first, a dusting of white that outlined the dark branches of the pines. But then the sky turned a bruised, iron gray, and the real storm hit. It was a blizzard, a howling fury of wind and snow that buried the valley. The wind shrieked through the ravine, a physical force that tore at the trees and scoured the mountainside. Inside her house, Alara was safe. The stone walls, 2 feet thick, muffled the storm's rage to a low moan. The heavy shutters were barred, the new roof held fast, and a great fire roared in Elias Holloway's magnificent hearth. The house was no longer a ruin or a project. It was a sanctuary, a fortress of competence built by the combined knowledge of 2 master craftsmen and brought to life by her own 2 hands. She felt a deep, abiding peace, the satisfaction of being warm and secure in a shelter she had raised herself against the wilderness. Late in the afternoon of the second day, there was a frantic pounding on her heavy oak door. She unbarred it to find Jed, the old trapper, half frozen and covered in snow. He had been caught out on his trap lines when the storm hit, and had spent a night in a makeshift shelter. Seeing the smoke from her chimney had been his only hope. He stumbled inside, his face pale and his hands numb. Alara sat him by the fire, wrapped him in blankets, and gave him a hot stew she had simmering over the flames. He was too exhausted to speak much, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were filled with a profound gratitude that needed no words. Her solitary refuge had just saved a life. The storm raged for another day. Just as it began to show signs of breaking, another figure appeared, struggling through the deep drifts. It was Abel, the blacksmith. He was not alone. He was half carrying his wife, while his 2 small children huddled behind him. "The roof of my workshop gave way," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and worry, as she hurried them inside. "Part of our house, too. We saw your smoke." Without a moment's hesitation, Alara's home became a sanctuary. She gave Abel and his family her own bed, making a pallet for herself and Jed by the fire. She shared her food, her warmth, her security. The small stone house, built by a man seeking solitude, was now filled with the sounds of a sleeping family, the quiet conversation of new friends, the crackle of a shared fire. Alara looked at the faces in the firelight, the wise old man of the mountain, the strong craftsman and his family, and felt a connection deeper than any she had ever known. This was community. It was not built on social niceties or casual acquaintance, but on the bedrock of mutual respect, shared hardship, and practical aid. She had not only rebuilt a house, she had, without realizing it, laid the foundation for a new life. Holloway's blessing had been fulfilled. When the storm finally broke, the valley was transformed into a world of white silence. The community, scattered as it was, began to dig out. Abel, his family safe, went with Jed to help other neighbors whose homes had been damaged. Alara's house became a temporary base of operations, a warm place for people to gather and plan the work of recovery. She had arrived in the valley a stranger, an outcast with nothing but a bag of tools. Now she was the anchor point, the quiet center of her small, resilient community. Spring came, and with it, a sense of renewal that felt more profound than ever before. The snow melted, feeding the creek and turning the ravine into a riot of green. Alara, with Jed's guidance, planted her garden in the rich soil of the drained sump. She planted potatoes and beans, squash and corn, her hands in the dark, cool earth. Abel, in gratitude, built her a heavy, beautiful oak door, hung on his own perfectly forged hinges. One bright, warm afternoon, she stood on her finished stone porch, leaning against a post of hewn pine. Jed was in the garden, showing her how to distinguish a weed from a native herb. Abel was on a ladder, putting the final touches on a new window frame, whistling a tuneless, cheerful song. The house stood proud and solid, as if it had always been there, its stones warmed by the sun. It was a home, alive and breathing. Later that evening, she stood before the hearth. The fire was low, casting a gentle, flickering light on the room. On the heavy oak mantelpiece her grandfather had taught her how to build, 2 objects sat side by side. One was the heavy brass plumb bob, its surface gleaming, its point aimed eternally at the true center of things. The other was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its head cocked as if listening. She had found it tucked away in a corner of Elias Holloway's cash, and his journal mentioned it was the last thing he ever made, the tool of her inheritance and the art of her predecessor, side by side. They represented the two pillars of her new life, the practical skill that had given her the power to survive, and the human spirit that had given her a reason to. She had come to this place with nothing, cast out and alone. She had bought a piece of land the world had deemed worthless, but her grandfather had not bequeathed her a house or money. He had bequeathed her competence. And Elias Holloway had not left her a treasure of gold, but a treasure of purpose. Looking around at the solid walls, feeling the quiet hum of contentment that filled the space, she knew with absolute certainty that the $250 she had given to a mocking clerk in a dusty office had been, without question, the best money she had ever spent.